Ja, eine beeindruckende Stunde haben wir hinter uns. Und wir kommen jetzt zur Podiumsdiskussion.
Now we want to start with our discussion, which is the official end of this meeting of young people. And I'm pleased that the two keynote speakers, Ms. Falkenstein and Dr. Traub, are here with us.
Ganz besonders, dass Frau Vizepräsidentin Ulla Schmidt
particularly pleased that Vice President Ulla Schmidt is with us as well. And last not least, Mr. Urbanski. Well, we had hoped that you would participate. Wasn't quite sure, so I'm all the more pleased and happy that you're here with us this morning. Warm welcome to all of you.
Wir haben eine überaus spannende Woche hinter uns. Zum 21.
This was a
Mal gab es
very
die Begegnung des
exciting week.
Bundestages
It was the
anlässlich der
21st of such
heute.
meetings of young people
Wir
on the
orientieren ja
occasion
immer
of the
Gedenkstunde
remembrance event.
Themenschwerpunkt.
And of course, the focus of this remembrance is always the sad subject of the victims of National Socialism. This year it was euthanasia. We went to Pirna Sonnenschein. We looked at the memorial site. It is a small memorial site, and I'd like to express our gratitude to the organizers and the managers of this memorial site. It was a really emotional and moving experience. We went to the Charité Hospital yesterday. We chose Charité deliberately because we also wanted to pick a site as to see how an institution that still exists deals with history, deals with what happened back then. And the two presentations we heard from the two professors, it was really impressive to hear how, when you look at doctors' biographies, at doctors' CVs, that you could kind of see how doctors became perpetrators. And also what you read to us, Mr. Urbanski, the perspective of the victims, made it quite clear how abysmal the events actually were. We saw Fog in August last night. And I had seen the movie before. Many of what we discussed throughout the days while we were together, many of that was actually reflected in the movie. And I think this was again, a really moving experience because it gave us a totally different perspective. What I found really impressive as part of this event was the fact that it is getting increasingly harder to meet contemporary witnesses, which makes it all the more important that you have emotional access to the events that took place back then. Let me start with the two keynote speakers. During both your speeches, you touched upon a subject that also came up time and again during the questions of the participants throughout the past few days. What actually motivated you to look into the fate of your relatives that were killed? And how did your family respond? How did your friends respond? That you dealt with your relatives' fate so intensively? Well, like I said during my speech, it was a shock because I had no idea, nothing. There was a picture at home on the wall. There was my grandmother with a small girl, and I knew that my father once had a sister who died very young. And then, at some point, my father presented me with documents. It was like a family tree in a way. And since I was working on the computer, he said, well, could you convert this in digital form? And I said, yes, why not? So, and then I thought I'd just Google my grandmother's name, who coincidentally had the same name as my aunt, Anna Lenkering. So, well, might be a rare name, so maybe something pops up. So I typed in the name, and all of a sudden, there were lots of hits. English speaking, in English language, an Israeli server list of persons murdered by German doctors, and it said Anna Lenkering. And I said, well, it can't be, right? I mean, my grandmother, she wasn't born in 1915. And then all of a sudden, it dawned on me that it must have been my aunt, and she used to be called Enne by the other family members. So this is how the whole thing started. And there were hardly anyone was alive who had known her. My father was the only one, basically. He was still alive, and he had these memory gaps, like black holes. And then it took me quite a while that he had pushed his sister's fate aside. A lot of this is to do with shame. And I was angry. I said, well, how could you not talk about your own sister? Things like that. And then I was lucky. I was lucky as far as my family is concerned, because I know that other families treated this issue differently. I found a lot of support in my family. My brother is here, my daughters. And there was one aunt, she's 93 years old today, who told me, kid, you know what, no, just leave it, just let it rest, the old stories, don't dig this up. She was uncomfortable with it, and she was afraid that it might become public. And just like to finish by saying that this aunt has changed her attitude since I got a lot of public attention for Anna in 2003. I initiated the laying of a stumbling stone in her hometown together with my father, and all of a sudden my aunt got positive feedback as well, and it helped her immensely. So in our family today, this is no longer an issue that is connected with shame. It is a positive thing. And this is why we talk about it.
Ja, herzlichen Dank, Frau Falkenstein.
Thank you, Ms. Falkenstein. Dr. Traub, what about you? How did your family deal with it? Well, I'm a social scientist by profession, and it was known in our family that my uncle was a victim of euthanasia. And, well, until 2005, 2007 maybe, 2008, I always knew that my uncle had been a victim of euthanasia. But to deal with it more intensely, that only started when the Historic Association of the city of Mülheim actually approached me based on the initiative by a students group, and they asked me if I was willing to write a short CV for the laying of a stumbling stone for my uncle. And I said, yeah, sure, no problem. But then I realized I didn't know anything about him, except for the fact that he was a victim of euthanasia. That was all I knew. My father used to collect many family pictures. I have diaries and tons of pictures from my father from the beginning of the 20th century up to his death. So I started going through these books and through these pictures, and I found like 30, 40 pictures of my uncle as a child, when he did his homework, during a chess competition. I asked the schools, I looked at the school records, I looked at his report cards, things like that. And so, step by step, this image of who my uncle was became alive. And I did not talk to my family about this a whole lot. My siblings didn't have great interest in it. But there's one aunt who died at the age of 93 last year, and she used to know my uncle back when they both were 14, 15, 16. And she said, "Oh, Benny? Yeah. Well, Benny, well, this is what he did." And she started telling these stories about my uncle. And during many phone calls, she told me how he was as a young boy, as a young child, and when he chopped off his finger, and how he had to deal with the fact that he could no longer pursue the profession of becoming a violinist and creating this psychological pressure. He didn't want to live anymore. He wanted to jump out of the window. And so this aunt told me a lot about my uncle, and I documented all these stories. And then I realized that there were many, many gaps in these stories. And Germany has a great bureaucracy, we know that. So it was pretty simple, actually. It was pretty simple to do some research. And it was easy to find out where my uncle was treated, for how long, where he was transferred to, when he was brought into this extermination institution, who the doctor in charge was, etc. And there were pictures there. I went to the institution, visited the institution. So this is how I started dealing with my uncle's life intensively. And I still have contact with the students who initiated the laying of the stumbling stone. They read out my uncle's biography. It's one page, 2 girls, 13, 14 years old. They invited me to visit the school, and we do this very intensively in our city. There's a lot of initiatives dealing with these stumbling stones, remembering victims of National Socialism. And so this was basically how it all started. Students' initiative, the family, my father's archive, if you will, that I looked through, and of course the different official institutions where I was able to look at documents dealing with my uncle. I think no one, apart from my sister, knows that I'm here today. No other family member knows. Many friends know, but not many family members, because I realized that things that were never dealt with really within my family, and I have a lot of siblings. There's still a taboo connected to that, and they ask me, well, why do you deal with this? You know, it stirs you up emotionally. You have other things to do. So these traumatic experiences, they are still there. You know, still in the subsequent generations, they're still there. And when we spoke about this, also here, I think it became clear that the subject is not over, even if the traumatic experiences of those who were contemporary witnesses end, because the stories are still there. Thank you. Yeah, I think this is a very common experience when we speak about traumas being passed on to following generations. That's really not uncommon. I just mentioned my grandmother briefly. When I was a child, she made several attempts to take her own life, and I didn't know why. And then I was told, well, Grandma is now in psychiatric care in Düsseldorf, and I visited her a couple of times. This psychiatry ward still looked like it was in the 40s, and she really developed major old age depressions. Again, this was not really talked about. Was just said, well, they're on the nervous side, and there must be something in the family. It's a different issue, and there might be families that have a disposition for psychiatric illnesses. It's possible, I guess. And I assume something like that exists in my own family, but it doesn't have to break out. You don't have to become depressive. You can become depressive, sure, in situations of crisis. I mentioned earlier that another relative was stigmatized of being of less value, and he was also forcibly sterilized back then in the 40s. So there is a family history there. So when I started researching into this euthanasia business, I really didn't know a lot about this issue, so I thought there must be a connection. So then I looked at my grandmother's hospital records, and I saw from the records that her own traumatic experience had to do with her mental state. And my father, his silence, a person who never showed many emotions, all this is connected. All this is connected, and it is passed on to the children and to other generations. But still, I say, well, we cannot just accept it. It's 2016. I say I was born in 1946. So it is about time to counteract, and I think you can counteract. You have to find something positive in this issue. And the fact that Sebastian Urbanski spoke to us earlier, this was so positive. It was great. It was a great experience because it was of symbolic importance for him to speak before the German Bundestag. It was normal, you know, it was no big deal. It was normal, but the fact that it was normal is of great symbolism.
Ja, mir ging das auch so.
Yeah, I can only agree.
Normalerweise ist es nicht so, dass wir die Künstler, die auftreten,
usually
mit einladen.
We do not invite the performing artists to participate in this round, but it was actually Ms. Schmidt's idea to have you here with us. So I'm really grateful that you're here with us this morning. You're an actor. You're part of the Rambazamba Theater here in Berlin, and it is really worthwhile looking at their plays. It's really great. When you think of your colleagues know that you're here with us today, I assume, and I'm sure you talked about this. They also know what you talked about here today. Were there any responses from your colleagues? Did you actually discuss today's matter, or is that something the theater and you personally are involved in? Well, we have plays dealing with euthanasia, where words like Hadamar and euthanasia are used, and where the doctor really suctions fatty tissue from the body and does experiments and things like that. So then I was approached and I was asked if I was willing to read Mr. Putzky's letter here in the Bundestag. And I thought, hey, his name ends with K-I, just like Urbanski, and his name is Putzky, why not? And it somehow fits, you know? Because I am active to remember those who suffered under National Socialism, who were victims and who deserve to be recognized. So I think it was good that I read this letter here in the Bundestag to just read out the undescribable suffering. Because this remembrance hour, and in today's time, I think it is high time to really award him this form of respect and dignity. Thank you, Mr. Bansky. When we visited the Pirna institution, Peter Jenneweit, for example, I brought this brochure here, a boy who was born in 1931, killed in 1940. And what you just said, that the things that happened should not be discussed in an abstract way, but that we should remember the victims, that we look at the victims' stories. And like you said, you also convert these stories, these fates into a theater play. The stories of people who were killed following this perverted logic at the time. I would like to direct a couple of questions at Ulla Schmidt. I know that she always defended the interests of people with disabilities as Minister of Health, also in other functions. And like we heard in today's speeches when Speaker Lammert said that remembering the victims of euthanasia started very late and in a very hesitant fashion. Sometimes the names of victims are not disclosed in order to protect the families. I don't know from what, but this is a whole array of issues and of questions. Why did we start so late to remember these victims? But what perspective do you see when you look forward? Well, why so late? Yeah. Many things started late when we look at our culture of remembrance. We spoke about the Holocaust, we never spoke about the perpetrators. When I was Minister of Health, I awarded scholarships so that the role of doctors could actually be discovered, and that was at the end of the 20th century. It was 2000, around 2000, and I remember doctors' conventions where, when I addressed the issue, I was met with a wall of silence. But it was the doctors who selected the victims, who did vivisection. They wrote the certificates. They decided about the fate of victims. That's one thing. Secondly, after the Second World War, people with disabilities were hidden away. When we were children, when we were young, you wouldn't see handicapped kids. There were war invalids, but that was different because they had served their country. But people with disabilities, you didn't really see them. And if you did, your parents would say, "Don't look at them, don't stare." So it was all very hush-hush. And in 1958, the Lebenshilfe institution was created, and until then, children with mental disabilities were considered unteachable. And actually, this is until 1989, the GDR. And there was one person, a Dutch person, who died at the age of 100 last year. He was a forced laborer. He had suffered under National Socialism during the war. And he said, we have to say yes towards life. His whole life was a yes towards life in all its different facets. So it was about creating a different attitude as to how we deal with disabilities. And disabilities, when we look at different disabilities, mental disability is still regarded different from physical disabilities. If a person is of normal intelligence, maybe they are deaf, maybe they are blind, whatever. But with mental disability, it's always harder to be integrated in your society. And this entire process when we think about how to implement the Convention of the Rights from people with disabilities, to enable every person to participate in daily life, that's an inviolable human right. This will give us the opportunity to also deal differently with issues like euthanasia. And the debates we have today, where parents sometimes ask, well, did you really have to have this child? You could have had an abortion. You still hear that sometimes. And we had a press conference about prenatal testing, a blood test performed during the first weeks of pregnancy, where you can decide if there's a Down syndrome or no, and you could take a decision that no person should be born with Down syndrome. But Down syndrome is not something you suffer from. You can become ill or you cannot. But when you have Down syndrome, you suffer from how society reacts. So this battle to make sure that every life is considered of equal value, this is what makes it so hard. And this is what causes people to think that it's their own fault. I was a teacher for special needs kids, and I met parents that always thought it's my fault. Is it my fault that something went wrong during delivery when the child was born? And this perceived guilt, it was always there. Is it my fault? Are there any hereditary diseases in my family? Something to do with the names. You mention a name and automatically the whole family is stigmatized. And so there's many stereotypes. Many misguided perceptions do exist, and Nazi ideology wasn't just invented. Nazi ideology was based on something existent. Those who were considered as imbeciles and idiots, this is exactly what those ideology was based upon. The same as when we speak about racism and other things today, you always have to be careful how things spread out, and all of a sudden people start accepting it and they like it, and this is really dangerous, and this is why we need this culture of remembrance. This is why it is so important. And the good thing today was that so many people say, well, it is about time that people are recognized as Nazi victims, and that finally we mention the names, and this is our job, that we really take this on. Because it is high time really to put things on the table and to speak about it openly. Well, Dr. Traub wanted to add something here. Yes, just two things from my own story. The first, it was in the Netherlands that for the first time I met a group of people with mental disabilities. That was in the Netherlands. In Germany, nowhere. And I know that you used to be a special needs teacher. When the Duisburg School for Special Needs Children was established, it was supposed to be established at an important location between Mülheim and Duisburg, and it was moved to a different location just on the outskirts of the city, tucked away. So there is this continuity of ignoring things, of closing your eyes, and of keeping things out of sight that was kept alive for decades. You mentioned the stigmatization of families. Like I said, I have 8 siblings. 7 of them are boys, and I'm the second youngest. I went to the same school as all my brothers visited. My oldest brother is 14 years my senior. And I remember when I was 13 or 14 years old, and my teacher said, sit down, you have this hereditary burden. So when I was a child, when I was a young person, a lot of terms were used that stemmed from the Nazis' racist ideology or this social Darwinism based thinking. So they said you are genetically predisposed, so sit down. So, but when I went to the Netherlands for the first time, it was normal that you saw people with disabilities. And of course it is also related to the role that doctors played, and doctors had a great influence on the fact that things were suppressed for so how long. Ms. Falkenstein. Well, back in the 60s, former T4 assessors were asked to decide about the recompensation of people that had been forcibly sterilized, for example. And there was one professor that said it's a neurosis of recompensation. So, clear rejection, really. So, I'd just like to add something. Everything we hear today sounds terrible, and it was terrible. But you have to look beyond Germany, and there was this eugenic thinking, which didn't exist in Germany alone. But it was in Germany that it was perverted in a terrible way. But I do believe that we really made progress. We see this here today, but we see this on other occasions as well. Many things were changed for the better in the past few years, and I'd just like to point this out here.
Thank you very much. Yes, yesterday we went to the Charité Hospital. The role played by doctors was also one of the things we looked at. We talked about euthanasia of children and the idea that some of the doctors involved were able to continue their careers, continue to work in the area of child psychology afterwards. That's something that just leaves you speechless, but I'm sure that that has changed today. And yes, this idea of shame within a family, this strange idea that you shouldn't talk about these things. And I think that was something that you saw in other contexts as well, too. The question about asking your father what he did in the war, for example, that was difficult, though all those decades ago. And I'm sure in those families affected by euthanasia, it was even more difficult. And one thing I noticed when we were in Pirna was this kind of normality which existed side by side with this madness. I don't know how you experienced it. We did a guided tour and we were standing outside, and they said that the ashes were tipped down the hill once a week. And our guide said people lived nearby, they had their houses down there, and on those days they didn't put out their washing to dry. This was something I found quite moving in a way, this idea of normality existing alongside this madness. It seems almost impossible to believe today. And in Hadamar, it was the same thing, because there were the chimneys which were on full view. And I know that you were very hard working yesterday when we were talking about questions. And when I heard what questions you wanted to ask, I knew that there were enough to keep us busy for the rest of the week. But I would like to give you an opportunity to ask some questions. So put your questions to the members of the panel. Remember to switch your microphones on as well. And when you've finished speaking, turn off the microphone. And please say who you would like to put the question to. Yes. So who's going to ask the first question? Who's going to break the ice? I have a question with regard to forced sterilization, and I want to put the question to Vice President Schmidt. I've been looking at this subject, and something has occurred to me. There's something I don't understand. I think there were about 350,000 or 360,000 people who had undergone this forced sterilization. I don't understand why they were not recognized as being victims like the other victims of the Nazis, and why it has taken so long for this idea of compensation for them to be developed. And I know that the law has been condemned as having been unjust, but as far as I know, there is no official statement which has been made about this forced sterilization itself, that the people, the victims, should be recognized as equal victims. And that's something which is hard to grasp. I wouldn't have thought it would be that difficult to recognize them as victims, and it seems very unfair to me, so perhaps you could react to that.
Yes,
I think it's connected with what I said just now. It did take a long time, but overall the issue of Holocaust, which was dealt with by films, etc., took a long time. I did my Abitur exam in 1968, and then I began to study, and that was the point when people were starting to deal with the past, starting to look with the role of Nazis at the universities, etc. But it took a long time until the other victims were also recognized. That applies to the Sinti and Roma, for example. People said this was not a racial type of persecution. It was generally criminals who moved around, and then there were the homosexuals, of course. They had to wear these pink stars. And it was not till 1998 that we actually changed Section 175 in the law. When I was young, homosexuality was still illegal. It was punishable by law. And the law had just been taken on in both parts of Germany after the war. From the Nazi time, it was not changed. So it took a great deal of time before people started struggling for the rights of homosexuals. And the question as to people with genetic diseases and people who were the victims of forced sterilization, that is still an issue today. But there is still a question today as to whether people who have mental disabilities should undergo forced sterilization or sterilization with the consent of their parents. And this is a similar idea to the idea of mercy killings. The idea was that sterilization would protect those people from having children. And so it's important to recognize the fact that people with disabilities are equal with other people. There was a campaign called Forget Me Not when I was young, and there were sort of people with disabilities to kind of do an outing with people with disabilities. People believed that those with disabilities were suffering, they were chained to their wheelchairs. They're not actually chained to their wheelchairs. They're perhaps limited because they can't get over the street with a wheelchair. But that was the idea, that people with disabilities suffered a great deal. And it was important to change this mindset. And that's why it took so long for us to actually move forward. And that is why I am very much a supporter of the implementation of the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. It's not important just for the people with disabilities themselves. It's important for everybody else to realize that we're talking about human rights here, human rights which are inviolable. I can remember when we had to struggle for women's rights to be recognized as human rights. People just used to talk about the rights of working men, and that has changed. And that's the important thing. It's really important for all people. So to begin with, people said, yes, they were victims, but they were not victims of the Nazis because this whole eugenics discussion had begun earlier. And for a long time, we had a law which said that women had the right to carry out an abortion if the child was going to be disabled, and we've changed this. And I think the next step has to be really for these people to be recognized as victims of the Nazis. And if we look at the right-wing populism we're experiencing today, which is directed at refugees, for example, or other minorities, and also at people with disabilities, if we look at this, it's about having kind of scapegoats, making people scapegoats who are not in line with the norm within society. That's why it's so important to talk about it. But I hope that this step will be taken as a result of our ceremony today. Sometimes you need something like this to get things moving, and I hope that we will make progress. Then, if that's the case, this will be a historic event today. And I will make sure that it gets put on the agenda again, at least. And I think that probably there will be a majority in favor of this. I just wanted to briefly say something. There are only a handful of people who are going to really benefit from this. This would be something symbolic. Of course, the symbolism is important. At the same time, though, it's a sad thing that so few people are still alive to benefit from it. And this is something we need to realize if we look at the historical context. In the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s, even amongst policymakers, there were people involved who prevented this change. People said that compensation for those who were the victims of forced sterilization would be a burden on the federal budget. They were talking about each of the victims getting about 5,000 Deutschmarks at the time. So that was the mentality at the time. People didn't want to recognize them as victims of the National Socialists. And then there was the political side of things, that people were saying this is going to cost too much. And also you shouldn't underestimate the fact that the perpetrators were still there. They were still in the midst of society at that time. And if you listen to Bernd Höcke today, who has talked about our Holocaust memorial being a scandal, and saying that the German population, the German people, is too self-critical, and these right-wing nationalists are communicating Nazi ideology. It's the same kind of thing. And these people were in all the official offices at the time. They were in the ministries, etc. And that is why things could not change that quickly. And that's why I see the culture of remembrance as so important. Because we're not responsible for what happened at that time, but we do bear the responsibility for how we shape the future. So it's a long road to go down, but we have already achieved quite a lot. I can compare the situation now to the situation when I was a child, and we really have made enormous progress, because there were people who said, no, we're not going to accept this status quo, we want to change things. And that's something that's important for you as a message as well. We won't accept things as they are, and we will change things. Dr. Traub wanted to come in at that point, and then we'll ask some more questions. I wanted to move away from our precise topic and take a broader perspective. As soon as somebody is defined as being a victim, then you define somebody else as being the perpetrator. And at the time, the perpetrators were still in power. And that was why it was impossible, and it still applies today. Any more questions? Let's start over at the back.
Sehr geehrte Frau Falkenstein und Dr.
Ms. Falkenstein, Dr. Traub,
Ich habe eine persönliche Frage an Sie.
I have a personal question to both of you.
Welche Bedeutung hat es für Sie heutzutage, die Tatsache,
What meaning does it have for you today, the fact that family members of yours were victims of euthanasia during the National Socialist era? Well, my life has changed. Finding this out really changed things, and there were two motives which drove me. First of all, it seemed such a terrible injustice, and I wanted to make sure that Anna received this recognition. She only died 6 years before I was born. I wanted to make sure there was some kind of remembrance of her, and I wanted to kind of give her back her dignity, even if it sounds maybe over-exaggerated. I wanted to make sure that we remembered her again. First of all, just remembered her within our family. And then there was a second point. I was very concerned by the way people remained silent. People hushed these things up. And I said to myself, why did I not ask earlier about what had happened to her? And I now have lots of contact with other families. And one woman said something at that time. She said, you know, in our family, there was a kind of silence. Nobody dared really ask any questions. And that's what I said during my speech. It's so important to end this silence. That applies in all sorts of areas. It's so important to talk about things. And I think I really gained a lot for me and for my life in general. I really gained a lot of recognition. I learned an awful lot about my family, which explained certain things within my family as well. And then there was another really important thing it did for me. I live here in Berlin, and when I saw that there was only this very small plaque which was there at Tiergartenstraße 4 as remembrance, then I began to get involved. I began to campaign, and it was a really good feeling to meet so many other people. Perhaps there weren't that many people, but suddenly I got to know other people, and there were more and more people who said, something has to happen. We have to talk about this. We have to make sure that the public finds out about it. And until then, I'd not had any contact with people with disabilities. And I was also a bit uncomfortable, a bit unsure about how to have contact with people with disabilities. And we had this round table to set up this remembrance point. And suddenly I was confronted with disabled people. And Matthias Vanaldi, I remember, said that we tend to have this kind of almost charitable view of people. And that was when I realized that, yes, I also have this external perspective, as if they were kind of separate to me. So I could talk about that for a long time, but that was one of the important things for me. And things have changed. I always think about my father. I never knew Anna. Of course, I thought about her, but I also thought about my family. And I think about the family, about Hartmut's family. We actually happen to come from the same place, and our families didn't live very far apart. What would it have meant for our families if they could have talked about this? They could have had some kind of public recognition, as we've experienced today at the German Bundestag, and all these things wouldn't have happened. Well, as to what it meant for me personally to look at the suffering of my uncle, well, things did change as a result for me. On the one hand, I became aware that I am part of a history, a story. And history is not something that just happens separately to people. It's not just something you read about in the paper. My own family's life story is part of history, part of European history. Part of the history which took place here in Germany, a history which affected my family. So that was really important for me. I'd studied history, and I thought these were very interesting topics, and I thought you could talk about these things at an academic level, etc. But to actually realize that I am part of this process was really, really important. This was my own life story. I was researching things about my own life, about the life of my father, my mother, the life of my aunt, my uncle. And I've already spoken about the photos that I looked at. In my garage, I have a bench on which my uncle used to sit to do his homework, and my father took a photo of that. And there is a poem, for example, which he wrote. And my aunt sent me that. So this life story of a person who became a victim of the National Socialists, is not just a story of somebody who was a victim of the National Socialists. This is the story of my uncle. It's a personal story, and it could have been my father. The same thing might have happened to him. So I think that's really a change in my perception of history. And something else changed in my life as a result too. I was unable to understand how the generation which was directly affected, I couldn't understand how the generation which was directly affected had reacted. My father was recruited to fight in the war in 1941, and 1 week before that, my grandparents received this letter of condolence about the murder of his brother. And I said to my father, "How did you manage it? You just found out that they had killed your brother." My grandfather wrote a poem about his sons, and in this poem he said that it was clear that his son had been murdered. And my father wrote in his journal, "Our poor Benjamin has died." And the next thing we see in his diary is this call-up letter for him to go and fight on the Eastern Front. I don't understand how they could kind of separate these things in their heads, how they could manage to do these things. I would have liked to have asked my father, how on earth did you manage that? How could you have gone and fought on behalf of this system which had just killed your brother? You could have escaped, you could have tried to run away, you could have tried to resist. Was there not any other kind of option? But no, he was given signals training, and he then served in the army for 4 years. And my older siblings tell me that my grandmother lost all her 4 sons apart from my father, and he only half came back, if you like. And nobody talked about it. It just wasn't an issue. And my older siblings said, because they remembered my grandmother better, they said when grandmother used to come back from cooking, she would sort of be going, she would be singing in the kitchen. But her eyes were red because she'd been crying in the kitchen, so she tried to hide it all. She didn't want anybody to see this. And so this was something which really changed my perception of my family. I'd never been able to understand the way that my father dealt with his own life story. I'd never been able to deal with this issue of confronting a society with this history. So that really changed things for me. I'd say let's take about 3 questions at once. Who wants to ask a question or make a comment? Yep, we'll take those 3 questions first of all.
Yeah, okay. Meine Frage richtet sich an Frau Schmidt.
My question is to Vice President Schmidt. You talked about participation of all people in society, about inclusion, regardless of whether people have a disability or not. And you talked about the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. Do you believe that this convention is being implemented adequately, and what opportunities do you see to improve the way in which the convention is implemented? My question is also to Ms. Schmidt. Racism seems to be increasing in Germany. How do you see this? Even though, of course, the Nazi era is dealt with a great deal in the schools.
Meine Frage wäre an Frau Falkenstein und Herrn Traub.
My question is to Ms. Falkenstein and Mr. Traub. You just mentioned the fact that there were some people within your family, not many people, but some people who didn't want you to find out about the past. And Ms. Schmidt also said that today people can't understand parents giving birth to a disabled child, even though they are aware of that fact. Do you think there are still parts within society who believe this? And do you believe that might be one of the reasons why euthanasia is one of the less well-known crimes of the Nazis? Thank you very much. Ulla Schmidt, perhaps you would like to begin. First of all, on the question of the Disabled Rights Convention, I would say we are on the right path. We have made progress. But you can't just simply hit a switch and implement everything at once. The federal president gave a speech on this issue, and he said that we're not talking about a utopia of inclusion, but it is one of the greatest emancipatory projects within society, and it will change society fundamentally. We began in 2000 here in Germany to move towards this idea of inclusion when we reformed our social code. And the Schröder government looked at the idea of equal opportunities for disabled people, the anti-discrimination law was adopted, etc. And the Disabled Rights Convention was part of this whole process, and Germany was involved in it. But we in the Social Democrat Party had to fight for the Bundestag to ratify the convention in 2005. So maybe nothing much happened for 5 years, and then there was a new discussion because two things happened. Firstly, disabled people themselves were involved in the Convention for People with Disabilities. They really were involved in the process, and they got stronger and stronger in their lobbying. And within the Lebenshilfe organization, I saw that people with disabilities have been really involved. There are people with mental disabilities, for example, who are really involved in the work of the organization, members of the board, etc. And we now have a participation law that we've adopted, an inclusion law. And the idea is to look at the rights of individuals and to see what support individuals need and say that is our goal. So what does society have to do to make sure that these burdens are removed? It's also about people who are deaf, for example, people who are blind, visually impaired. It's also about easy language, etc. It's not just about making things accessible to wheelchairs. But if you want to ask what we've achieved so far, I would say in 1958 there was nothing at all. And if we look at all the different institutions we have today, the different facilities, we have the first generation of pensioners in Germany with mental disabilities. We're experiencing that now in Germany. But there are so many different opportunities today for people to work, for example. Of course, it's not perfect. It's a work in progress. But one mother once said to me that all these things happening, the increased inclusion, the increased support for people, all of these things are important to the people concerned. It's as if there are new kind of skills which are developed by the people concerned because they have these opportunities to actually do more things. And the laws are not perfect in Germany. We don't have an obligation to ensure accessibilities by private entities, for example. So it's not perfect. There are all these hurdles, all these obstacles. So we have achieved quite a bit, but yes, of course, we have some more things we would like to achieve, and I hope that I will live to see that as well. And we're talking about local work, step-by-step work at a concrete level. We're talking about inclusive schools, inclusion in the workplace, and the participation law was not able to find a majority for one thing. The law states that disabled people should be able to go to these workshops, and we still have this sentence which says that they should carry out a certain minimum level of useful work. The exception to that is North Rhine-Westphalia. They don't have this sentence, and it's been so difficult to remove this sentence from the law so that people have the right to go to work. I I think that's really important, but that's been very, very difficult. We need to get rid of this sentence, but we have to approach it step by step. And then with regard to racism, I would like to see this being an important topic in all schools, but I'm not sure that that is always the case. We do have very good schools. We have some teachers who are extremely committed, but then there are some schools where people look at this topic, but not with much enthusiasm. And I am worried about the growing trend towards right-wing extremist views in Europe. Trump is kind of shows the culmination of what can happen if you try and marginalize certain groups. He is now president, but he is actually making fun of disabled people. He has criticized Muslims, Afro-Americans. It's kind of a racist ideology. And the thing is that people start to get persecuted and violence against people becomes something normal. That was something we saw in the race riots in the 1970s, and now we're seeing these attacks by right-wing extremists in Germany. It's about marginalizing people. It's about telling people that the Muslims are our enemies. The refugees are responsible for everything. None of the terrorists were true refugees. Most of them had been in Germany for quite a time or had been criminals before they became refugees. And that's important to stress. So I am concerned at the moment. And what we need today is to raise our voices and to make sure that everybody has this right at the workplace, at school, etc. Everybody should be lobbying, should be campaigning wherever they are, whatever school they are at, whatever workplace they have. And I think that 85% of people in Germany don't have these ideas, and we shouldn't be too depressed by the 15% who do have these views. We have to try and influence another 5% of those 15% and just kind of keep a lid on those people who have these terrible views. I wanted to say something about the subject of these issues, this history being taboo within families. Here too, I would say we have achieved quite a deal. And I was really, really upset about the fact that my grandmother and my father, etc., had not talked about this story. But now I can understand it better. My father was a young man at the time, and he was the victim, in a way, of brainwashing. It began at school. The children were told that these people with disabilities had less value than people who were able to make a contribution to society, as it was seen at the time. But if you think of these memorial sites, for example, there are more of those, and there are more and more family members who are looking at what happened in their own families. There are more and more films, more and more plays being shown, so something is happening. Public perception is beginning to change, and of course the families are also part of society, and this hushing up of the family story was just part of what happened in society as a whole. So when society becomes more open, individual families also become more open. So I think that we are on the right path at the moment. There's somebody called Wilhelm Heidmeier. He's a sociologist in Bielefeld, and he has published 15 volumes on Germany. And I think you need to be clear that there was great resistance to this kind of work. There was great resistance in terms of people's mindset. He comes to the conclusion that the whole ideology of efficiency has changed over the last 10 years. He believes that this whole idea that people need to be efficient, need to work efficiently, has actually increased over the last 10 years. He believes the understanding of the fact that certain people need to be integrated into society, even if they do not fit these criteria of being efficient, of being productive, etc. He believes that this is actually decreasing this understanding. So that's something we need to look at too. We need to make sure that we work on this We need to make clear that we're not just talking about a question of integration or of inclusion. It's also a question of mindset. It's about how we view the value of human life. So it's a very fundamental question, I believe. And you mentioned the issue of racism, and I believe there is a link here. Because this idea of efficiency, of strength, of productivity shapes a whole kind of thinking, a thinking which says that people who are weak, people who are not able to make a contribution, that they are worth less in some way. And this ideology did not suddenly die in 1945. I believe this mindset has continued to this day. And I still think we have a great deal to do. We have to see to what extent we can change this mindset, this idea about having to be good, having to be productive, having to be the winners. Does that mean that everybody else is a loser? Those people who are not the winners, are they losers? And I think things need to change in people's heads. I think things are changing, but it's important to really look carefully here and to be very careful in your argumentation and to look at the impacts that this ultimately has. And this was something which the bishop said in 1941, we are all going to get old. We are all going to be of no use, no productive use in the future. Do we all want to then not be accepted by society? So this is about mentality, really.
Herzlichen Dank. Mir ist, bevor ich wieder aufmache, eine Frage an Herrn Urbanski eingefallen. Und zwar
this was a question I wanted to ask Mr. Urbanski. As an actor, you said that there was a play performed at your theater dealing with euthanasia. How did this work? Were there lines the actors had to learn? Or was it something that your group created yourself? How did that work? Well, we produce our own plays, all of us together, with our ideas, and Mongopolis, as it was called, also deals with the Second World War and the devil, for example, had Downs, and he said, everything belongs to me and I won't give anything back. And all the water, he held back all the water, and with that he tries to create the perfect human being that only know how to use a typewriter, for example. And it is also this whole machinery that's also part of the play. So sometimes we talk about these issues, of course, the issues we discuss here, and so there's also an exchange, there's a dialogue, and we speak about these issues as well. Well, that's fascinating that you not just perform, but that you actually produce the plays and that you kind of present the things you are affected with personally. That's really fascinating. Okay, more questions.
Ja, ich habe eine Frage an Herrn Urbanski,
It's a question to
darauf bezogen, dass Herr
Mr. Urbanski.
der Sprache der Barbarei sprach,
Professor
die dann in den
Lammert
Geist der
spoke
Barbarei
about the barbarity of speech becomes the barbarity of spirit.
dass wir ganz viel Begriffe
And this is something I understood. There are many terms we use that come from National Socialist times, and we use them without really thinking about them. We make distinctions between normal and not normal, and healthy and sick, and so I think we always have to be careful how we speak, and what kind of language we use when we speak. The question is also, do we speak with people or do we speak about other people? And it's kind of sad that this round has not an inclusive character, for example. That might have been an idea. But, Mr. Urbanski, when we speak with you, or when we speak about you, is there anything that puts you off? Is there anything you would like to see differently?
Also ich stehe insgesamt für alle Menschenrechte.
I think I'm here
Und stehe auch dafür, dass jeder leben kann, wie
for all human rights, and I support the notion that everyone should be able to live according to their own notion and their own free will.
Dass jeder akzeptiert wird, solches
And that everybody is accepted the way they are.
Jeder sein Leben lebt, wie eben.
And that everybody basically can live their life as they please, and no matter whether they're handicapped or not.
Nicht so viel die Rolle, weil da ist das Thema, dass alle zusammenleben.
And
die Zeit heutzutage ist so, dass alle
in our
zusammenleben.
place, it is about living together. Everybody living together, everybody helping each other. And this is something we also see in real life today. That was different during Nazi times. Nobody asked how they could help the other. Decisions were taken, this person had to die because he had a mental disability. Today is different. And that is good. You have friends, and the friends ask, how can we help you? Is there anything you need? And this is, of course, something I really welcome.
Herzlichen Dank. Weil das ja sozusagen Inklusion Nummer
Thank you. You mentioned the inclusive character, and this is basically the system that we use. We ask different organizations to nominate young people who would participate in this event. So it's not us who selects the people, but yeah, that's it's good that you mentioned it. Maybe for next year we can really take this up in a stronger fashion. Just one question to Ms. Schmidt. Yesterday I read that there was some criticism that family members of former victims were not invited to certain events. Is that right? What's your reply to that?
Also meine Frage ging eigentlich in die gleiche Richtung.
Well, it was basically the same question.
Deswegen stelle ich die jetzt einfach mal zurück.
So I'd just like to hear Ms. Schmidt's answer. Is there another question? Question cannot be heard without a microphone.
Kannst du die? Während dieser Jugendbegegnung ist Während dieser Jugendbegegnung ist mir sehr stark aufgefallen,
during this event, I
das Thema Euthanasie wird fast kaum
noticed that euthanasia is hardly addressed in schools, although it would be relatively easy to integrate this as part of the curriculum. And it would provide young people with an opportunity to deal with this issue. Do you have any idea why this is the case? And is there any interest, any idea to change this, to make young people especially more aware of this issue and thus also to have them develop a greater interest in integration and inclusion?
Meine Frage geht an Frau Schmidt.
I also have a question. I'd like to direct that Frau Schmidt. You said that around the year 2000, when you went to doctors' conventions, you were met with a wall of silence when you were Minister of Health. Are you aware of any current intentions of the health sector, or maybe also the Ministry of Justice, to really deal with the legal situation of the 30s and 40s regarding forced sterilization and all that? Yes, I know the Association of Victims of Psychiatry that you mentioned, and Ms. Falkenstein also mentioned, one of the prominent members of this association. When you organize such an event, there's different things you have to consider. And for me, it was important to have Mr. Urbanski speak, because we have to make sure that people understand that you can achieve something, even with disabilities. We spoke about electoral right the other day, and there are still people who of course, are dependent on from comprehensive care. And some people think, well, if you're a person depending on comprehensive care, there's hardly anything you can do yourself, and this is something we have to fight against. You heard the musician earlier who was able to play this instrument without any hands, by using his feet. So there's always something you can do. And we had many people on the stage, and many people were invited, and you always sit together and think about who you should invite to such a convention or not. So, yes, it could have been done differently, and well, this was the decision we took, but I think the persons affected were heard. They were given the opportunity to speak. It was not an event about other people, but we had family members there, personal stories that were told, and with Sebastian Urbanski and Mr. Lammert, who put it in the political context, I think that this... Okay, Ms. Falkenstein. Well, you have to be a little careful. There's two associations, the Federation of the Victims of Euthanasia, and sometimes they get mixed up. There is Margaret Hamm, who's fought for this issue for years, and I met her running up to this event because I wanted to have forced sterilization included as an issue. And I felt as someone who had a personal interest in this. And this is why I also mentioned Dorothea Buck. I visited her the other day. She's almost 100 years old. And she was forcibly sterilized. But most contemporary witnesses are not able to speak anymore. They're just too old and frail. But the intention was to have people who are directly affected, and not, you did not want to have the event organized in an academic way. The purpose was to have it organized in a personal way. Right, the next question. You mentioned the doctors. There was an initiative, the former Chamber of Doctors here in Berlin. Yes, Alice Huber started pretty early, but they were almost kicked out as doctors in the 80s due to their activities, because they wanted to look into this issue. But here in Berlin, the Doctors Association started to first look into the fate of Jewish doctors that were persecuted, and well, quite honestly, some of the other doctors were quite happy to see them go, because there was more work and more money for them. So they looked into the fate of Jewish doctors who became victims of National Socialism. As a second step, they looked at the health structure, which was part of the social ministry at the time. There was no health ministry at the time. And then we went to the Robert Koch Institute, And then we realized, yes, Robert Koch Institute was involved in what took place during the Nazi regime, and those who didn't want to participate, they were kicked out. So it is a process that requires many steps. It requires documentation, what we did. Then we touched upon the issue of euthanasia. We had a big exhibition in 2014 here, together with Mr. Schneider, which dealt with victims of euthanasia specifically. And they portrayed individual stories, individual fates. This exhibition started here in the Bundestag, and then it traveled to various sites throughout the Federal Republic. And one of the main supporters, Professor Schneider, a doctor, he's a psychiatrist. And this Society for Psychiatric Diseases and Psychosomatic Diseases, they also became involved. But it only started at the beginning of the 21st century. This was when it was put on a broader basis. There always were individual actions, but to have this broader movement, and that the government actually started to deal with this issue, like the Foreign Office starting to deal with their own dark history. And it wasn't until 2002, 2003, that's when the Ministry of Justice and the Foreign Office started to look into their own history. There were many protests, by the way. They said, no, we didn't do that. No, what do you want? Stay away. No. And even in Lebenshilfe Association, we were established in 1958, so there was no historic burden, really. But when we looked at our own history, we realized that two of our founders used to be perpetrators. Which makes you kind of wonder, why do they join and establish this association? Maybe a sort of a remorse. But now we have Bethel, 150 years of Bethel, and the Bethel institution. Yes, they supported handicapped people, but they also operated institutions where people were killed and abused and tortured. So this is a process, and maybe it is this generation who is obliged to really take this on and to deal with the past, and this generation that has to say never again. And just to conclude the interview with the Pope, with Pope Francis, when he spoke about right-wing populism, he said, well, Hitler was elected too, and people supported him. That's kind of a strange statement, but principiis obstat. If you allow things to happen step by step, and all of a sudden you realize it's too late. And this is your job, guys. This is your job. Just a remark, I'd like to mention that Professor Schmidt mentioned yesterday, and he said in the sixth term, medical students have to study the subject of medical ethics if they study medicine at the Charité. And Professor Schmiedebach also said that doctors have a special responsibility. That's one thing. The other thing is that they are also particularly prone to fall victim to the prevailing zeitgeist. Sure, it was the profession that had most members in the National Socialist Party. And if you have the opportunity to visit the main GDR's memorial site, which has been co-financed by doctors, go to Altrese, the main memorial site where doctors were to be trained, where this entire ideology and this relation of trust between patients and doctors was to be abused for the strategy. and it was built on a hill, and the houses were numbered 1001, 1002, and so on, based on the 1000-year Reich, and so on and so forth. It's a very small memorial site, but when I visited, I realized that it was not just a crazy idea; it was a systematically planned killing machinery. And it's in Mecklenburg, actually. It's not that far away, and if you have the chance, go there and visit. It's really impressive. One comment on doctors. And here I mean the question of perpetrators. I mean, you could speak about this for hours. And at the beginning, I thought those were monsters. Must have been monsters. No, not monsters, just normal people. Was the local doctor up to a highly qualified reformist psychiatrists who were convinced that what they do was the right thing to do, that it was for the benefit of the people what they did. So you shouldn't forget this. And of course, for some there might have been the incentive to make more money or to make a big career. And I'm sure that was the whole spectrum of everything we see today, the whole spectrum of humanity. And it's so, you can be drawn into this so easily and so quickly. And what I'm saying here is you have to be careful. You have to be careful not to be abused by any ideology, because they were convinced, they believed in this stuff. They believed in this ideology, and that makes you blind. And this ideology, you meet it everywhere, you know. Especially you as young people, you will meet it all the time and everywhere. And it's small things, you know. It's like in the schoolyard, a queer, a idiot, stuff like that, you know. And to stand up and say, no, this is wrong, you shouldn't say this. That's the first step. That's the first right step. Okay. School books. Yes. School books. Maybe three remarks on that. Like I said, there are very productive groups, working groups in schools that deal with this issue, and they deserve every praise. And there are many projects that have been going on for a couple of generations. Quite often you have a situation where there's up to one teacher whether something takes place or not, but some schools have really developed a tradition to cover this issue. And secondly, school books are starting now to take up this issue, and also to look at this chapter of the Nazi regime. As we heard this morning, the traditional approach when it comes to dealing with National Socialism, up to 10 to 15 years ago, Shoah was linked with euthanasia in terms of ideology and also in terms of execution. And this is actually a relatively new finding. And now finally we see this also portrayed in history and teachings and in books. The fact that these two things cannot be separated, that it is interwoven. So that was the second thing I wanted to say. The third thing I wanted to say relates to what was just said. The persons who were affected, who were the perpetrators, those were a lot. And it's not just doctors, it was nurses, it was assistants, medical workers, health professionals, everybody. It's the whole society. It was not just the local SS guy, no, it was the local nurse, for example. And I'm sure that people were very hesitant to make this a general subject for history teaching at schools, for example, for that very reason. Anna, my aunt, has now become a part of various school books, but this did not happen until 2010, and I think, again, this is a symbol for us being on the right way, moving in the right direction. I have quite a lot of colleagues, and one of my colleagues from the Protestant faculty said, "Well, Anna Lenkering, I saw a theater play on Anna Lenkering. Could it be the same person?" I said, "Yes, it's the same person." Yeah. So now finally, these people become part of our memory. No, I just wanted to know whether things are now changing, whether school books are being changed, and this is included, but this seems to be the case. Yes, a question to Mr. Urbanski regarding schools. Are schools informed about what you do in your theater plays, and do you have school classes visiting your place, attending your place? So that the students actually see that people with disabilities can make great theater. Yes, we have many school classes, we have many university courses common to our theater, doing workshops, attending plays like Mongopolis, other plays as well, where they see that people with and without disabilities can work together, can play together on a stage, and can produce something. And then sometimes we return their visit, and we sometimes make music together, for example. Again, it's a great experience. It's the experience of doing things together, and I think this is what people need these days. And this is why I'm here, because I think this is also what you need, that the victims, that we are aware of the victims, but not just in our minds, also in our hearts, that we can remember them, and that they are part of us.
Herzlichen Dank. Also
Thank you.
Ich würde mal sagen, ein Königsweg, wie man
Thank you.
gut
That's
damit und produktiv und sinnvoll
never easy to achieve, to find a way how to bring all this together and use it in a meaningful way. But I think we did quite well. Okay, we have another round for questions. I know that Dr. Traub has to leave around 12:25. Ulla, Schmidt.
Also wir haben normalerweise bis dreiviertel eins.
We had planned till 12:45. Oh, no? No?
Okay.
Maybe?
Gut.
Good.
Dann mache ich noch mal eine Fragerunde auf.
Okay, one more round of questions.
Ich habe mal eine Frage an Frau Schmidt, und zwar hatte Frau Falkenstein
Yes,
in ihrer
question
Rede was
to
ganz Wichtiges erwähnt, und zwar
Frau Schmidt.
Datenschutz, Archivöffnung,
Ms. Falkenstein mentioned something very important in her speech about the opening of archives and the data privacy and everything, and you sounded very positive. But when you think at other views, and I mean, this is an issue that's been around for quite a while now, do you really think that things will change this year, and what kind of change do you have in mind? I cannot really imagine people to say, oh, okay, forget about data privacy, let's lay it all out in the open, and that they open archives without the consent of maybe family members or relatives.
Ja, ich hätte noch mal eine Frage an Herrn Urbanski.
My question goes to
an die von vorhin
Mr. Urbanski.
Aber ich wollte wissen, ob Sie denn heute immer noch, also oder ob Sie sich wünschen würden,
Would
dass
you
auch Sie oder
like
Menschen
to
generell mit
see
Behinderungen
that
einschränken,
you
mehr
or
an politischen
people with
Prozessen, also wir haben
disabilities
vorhin auch schon über dieses
are
UN,
more
gesprochen,
strongly
ob Sie sich da
involved
wünschen würden,
in
auch mehr teilnehmen
political
zu können und
processes?
ob es etwas
Would you
gibt,
like to
was Sie
see
heute,
more opportunities for
vielleicht auch
participation?
konkret stört?
And is there anything that you would really like to change? Anything you think is not good right now? Would you like to reply to that?
Also mein Wunsch ist, dass die Behinderten zusammen mit den
If you ask me what my wish
arbeiten
is
können.
that the disabled can work together with the non-disabled, that they become friends, and maybe that they become part of the political landscape. Some have done it. Mr. Schäuble, you know, he's handicapped, he's in a wheelchair. Others who are politicians with disabilities, yes. I would like to see more of that. You know, like I'm a guest here at the Bundestag, others as well who maybe could read letters in the Bundestag, could deliver a speech to the Bundestag, or maybe participate in a political in the political day-to-day work. I would like to see more cooperation. And I would like to see all political parties support the rights for handicapped, so that more can be done for us.
Jetzt zu der Frage, schaffe er das noch?
The question, what can be changed? Can be changed anything? You know, I'm from the Rhineland and I'm an optimist by definition. So if you don't have any plans, you won't achieve nothing. So the question about the names and disclosing names, this is not a new question. But we had hearings in the Bundestag on this issue, we had debates about how to deal with this issue. Why do I want to change the current procedure? I believe it is discrimination to not disclose those names. When we look at Holocaust victims, we want to say that we want to give the victims a name. The stumbling stones are there to give the victims a name. But if we now look at, and of course the families can always object. It is the families' right to say, no, we don't want to have this name disclosed. This right always exists, and you would never publish a name without at least trying to seek the family's consent. Some victims have no family left, but this is what we do. So, but why do you do it differently for euthanasia victims? Why do you call them Erna F. and Hans M. and Karl S. or whatever? It is still the idea that somehow the family is stigmatized. You're not stigmatized by having Jewish relatives. But with euthanasia victims, it's somehow different. Same with homosexuals, it's somehow different. And I've been fighting for having psychiatric illnesses recognized in the same way as you have regular illnesses. Illnesses are recognized. You can go to your boss and say, I have cancer. Your boss will think about how to help you. If you say you have a depression, you probably find a way to kick you out. I might exaggerate, but it still shows that there's still a difference when it comes to recognizing these different forms of symptoms and disorders. When you're in politics, you have to find a strategy. You have to use emotions. And when I sit here and speak to all the others and say, well, it's about time that we speak about this issue beyond party borders, and then they say, well, haven't we done that yet? And I say, no. So we should use this opportunity now. We should use this awareness. And since the Chancellor too said that she's very upset and that she's shocked, and it's not always a lack of will. It's more often the case that people are just not aware of it, or somehow gets forgotten in all your other daily activities. And when we think of names and disclosure of names, we have to take a different approach. Of course, families have to have the right to have the names not disclosed, but there should be no ban on this disclosure. Well, after 70 years, you do not have to ask me whether I want to have my Aunt Anna's name published or not. I don't see that as a necessity. And I followed this debate for a while, and I know that a couple of years ago there were family members who really refused for a variety of reasons. But things changed, also in the minds of people, and this is related to everything we mentioned before. There were various conferences on whether names should be disclosed or not. One just took place last summer in Berlin, and it was about the different archives for which the Federal Commissioner for Culture is responsible. And this conference was a great step forward, because for the first time people said that the personal interests of third parties, and I would be a third party, should not be considered, because more than 70 years have elapsed. So these but of course you should not publish health records from that time. That's private matter. But the names, it's part of the person. A name is part of your identity. And I'm really optimistic. I'm optimistic that in the foreseeable future we will see some sort of change. I'm really optimistic. Well, thank you. That's actually what we saw when we went to Pirna. There was this one room where they show the pictures in the front, and on the back they have a short CV and what happened to the people and their fate. And it was not an abstract description. It was very specific, with name and everything. So it was a short biography, cut short, brutally cut short, but these biographies were described with names and everything. Dr. Traub is kind of ready to leave. He's actually leaving.
Yes, I'd like to have another round of questions.
Okay.
My question is directed to Mr. Urbanski. You were born in 1978, and we've talked a lot about how society has changed over recent years. And today, there are many more opportunities available to people with disabilities. But do you believe that people's mindset has changed? Do some people still look down at you, seem to give you that kind of look when you see them on the street, people who don't know you? I would say overall a great deal has changed. Because in the past, people didn't speak as positively about people with disabilities. I think the views are more positive today, but still we're not completely accepted. And that's what I would like to achieve. I would like to have this acceptance of the fact that everybody can live together. And still, sometimes if you're going down the street, something like this does happen. A friend and colleague was asked why she didn't have any hair in the middle of the street. And I said, well, God didn't want her to have any hair, but she is still there, she is still a person. And I also played in a film, and that was one of the topics in that film as well. We were insulted in this film by young people. They called us mongoloids, spazzes, and this seemed to be something terrible. That was, yes, something very discriminatory. Nevertheless, I do think that things have changed and people are more able to see that disabled people are people whose life is just as valuable as the life of Ulla Schmidt, for example, or Sigrid Falkenstein, or the federal president, or the Bundestag president. All of them have a right to be here. They all have a right to have their say, to be involved in decision-taking, and they should be working together with people who have disabilities. So as I say, it's about working together, living together. And I think some people still are prejudiced. Some people do insult others on the street. That has to end. It's not just the insults which need to be changed and against the background of history as well, but also people need to actually really be accepted. I have a question to Ulla Schmidt. You talked about the social code earlier. And when I was studying business studies, we learnt about this. There is this section 71, which says that firms which had forced labourers have to employ a minimum number of people with disabilities. To what extent do you think it's a good idea and worthwhile to actually force people to apply this principle of inclusion? Well, I think if things were possible on a voluntary basis, then you wouldn't need to force people. It should be normal in society to have at least 5% of people with disabilities. What happens is that firms have to pay a certain amount of money if they don't employ enough disabled people, and this money is used for other purposes. I would prefer not to have laws like this forcing companies to do that. And I would also prefer these penalties to be higher if firms don't employ disabled people, because I believe that firms need to get used to this idea. There is a demographic development taking place within our society, so I hope that at some point society will realize how valuable the skills of all individuals are. People who used to only work in disabled people's workshops now are able to do completely different jobs. We see that with Mr. Urbanski, for example. For example, people with mental disabilities can give support to elderly people, people who perhaps have Alzheimer's or something. So they're not the full-on carers, but they kind of support them and accompany them. And there is one person who has dementia, and then perhaps children or young people who have Down syndrome tend to be very open. They have this strong emotional nature, and they don't care perhaps if something takes a bit longer than it might normally do. People don't have this feeling of having to rush things, whereas carers might try and hurry old people along and say you need to hurry up eating. And I think that's less the case with maybe people who've got mental disabilities. So I think there are a lot of win-win situations. Companies should be employing people, and they can perhaps employ people with disabilities. What about people who are autistic, for example? SAP has just discovered how capable people with autism can be. They've set up a whole department for autistic people. In the past, autistic people didn't have any opportunity to work because people were too worried about the behavioral problems, because they need to have this kind of structure in their day, and they need to perhaps be brought to their workplace. They perhaps need to be picked up again, but they can do an awful thing. So I do hope that the day will come at some point where we no longer need legal provisions of this kind. I'm looking at the time a bit, and I would now say let's have our final round of questions. Who would like to ask another question? Yes, you're looking tired. We don't have to have a further question, but if people have further questions, if you want to take this opportunity, then please do ask.
Aber selbstverständlich.
I would like to ask something. Where exactly were you at the Charité Hospital yesterday? There is an old building where the neurological department and parts of the psychiatry department are now. Is that where you were? There is a sculpture by Dorothea Buck. It's a sculpture of a mother and child. No, we weren't able to see that. That's a shame, because that's an example of coming to terms with the past. And I think it's about 8 years ago that Dorothea Buck was able to go along to the ceremony for the unveiling of this sculpture. And she never forgot this, that she was not able to have any children. It was an issue for her throughout her life, and it was very good for her to be able to go along to this opening ceremony and to see this statue being unveiled here. It was very important in symbolic terms for her. There's another question over there. Ladies and gentlemen, I have a question with regard to Hitler. What happened? Why did this all happen? Was it because Hitler wanted people who were able to serve as soldiers, or was it just because he was crazy? What was the motivation behind the whole thing? Was it just because he had the power, because he had the soldiers under his control and he was able to take these decisions? Why did the whole thing happen? Was it just because Hitler was in power and he had so much power? Well, I don't think it was Hitler just by himself. This was a whole ideology, a whole mindset. So many people believed this. Of course, you had to have certain figures, certain key figures, certain leaders, and that's the dangerous thing. That's why it's dangerous when you see populist regimes which seem to be spreading at the moment, even in Europe. These are kind of parties or movements that collect people, that take up a kind of thinking which already exists within society. And Hitler would not have been successful if there had not been enough people within society who supported this ideology. Sometimes when I look at the Pegida party supporters talking, it reminds me of Goebbels, for example. Goebbels used to say, "Do you want total war?" And people stood there, crowds stood there and said, "Yes, we do." And when I see these speeches being given today, for example, on the day of German reunification in Dresden, where people were being insulted as traitors to the people, etc., it reminded me of this. Democracy needs institutions, it needs free speech, it needs a free parliament, and we have so many things. Some things are not perfect within our society, but we have a state ruled by which is governed by the rule of law, with freedom of speech, with a free press, for example, and that is vital. And wherever you see right-wing populism growing at the moment, you will also see that the whole idea of critical press is called into question. I'm a politician myself. I don't like everything which is written about me by the press, but that is just the task that they have, and you have to live with that. But what I see with Trump, for example, is worrying whether he imposes these punitive tariffs, for example, or whether he reopens the mines and sends people back to work in the mines. Well, the danger I see is that he rejects everything which democracy is about. He thinks the House of Representatives is stupid. He thinks the Senate is stupid. He says they're not important. He believes his party is unimportant. And he talks about the lying press. And anybody who criticizes him is seen as a terrorist by Mr. Trump. And if that development carries on over years, and if society continues to become more divided, and if more and more people believe that the press lie, then that is a very dangerous development within society. That is something I'm really worried about. And there is too little being said about this. I think this is more important than whether BMW has to pay 30% tariffs. That's not as important, I think. It's just about who wants to buy which cars. Or if he says we're not going to allow things to be imported from Mexico, people in the USA won't be able to buy lots of products. But this rejection of all democratic institutions is what I find really worrying. That's the same with regard to Pegida, Wilders, Le Pen in Austria, in Hungary, in Poland. You see these developments in many countries. And that is the danger, I believe, and you should be careful about this. Because there might be a development within Europe which leads us back to the situation we've seen in the past. If you look at old films, you see Jewish people who say, I'm a German, I fought in the war on behalf of Germany. People didn't think any of this could happen. They just didn't think the Holocaust could happen. So that's why you have to be really sure to raise your voice. Thank you very much, Mrs. Schmidt. This was an urgent appeal, and I would like to take that to finish the discussion on that note, and I would like to thank all the participants.
So nach einer Woche intensiver Befassung mit
We've spent a whole week looking very intensively at this terrible issue. And now we've had this final discussion, which was a climax of the week, because it leads you to reflect about what you've seen during the week, to have an opportunity to talk to the speakers at the ceremony of remembrance. It was good to have Ulla Schmidt and Mr. Urbanski here in particular. So thank you very much for this. I would like to say thank you to you. As long as we have young people in Europe like you, I'm not worried.
Sehr schön, dass du mitgekommen bist. Ja? Ja, mein kleines Wer ist du? Ach, danke. Danke fürs Kommen. Ja. So. Frau Falk. Ja. Politik und Kunst. Danke fürs Kommen.